Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Thank you for having me again. As I've said in other weeks, I'm not an authority on anything, but I've got a good memory and I write stuff down. And everything I'm going to say about Tradition 4 has been taught to me by someone else. All I've done is compiled it, packaged it, and I'm placing it in front of you. I haven't originated anything myself. So if anything from today benefits you, there's an awful lot of other people that you need to be thanking, but not me. I'm just slopping out the food onto your plate. So, Tradition 4, short form. Each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. And the long form. With respect to its own affairs, each AA group should be responsible to no other authority than its own conscience. But when its plans concern the welfare of neighbouring groups also, those groups ought to be consulted. And no group, regional committee, or individual should ever take any action that might greatly affect AA as a whole without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board, if you can pin them down. On such issues, I doesn't say that. On such issues, our common welfare is paramount. Right. So, there's a general idea here, which I find very attractive and very helpful. Um, and it's of independence, that the group is independent. It's not beholden to the fellowship. It's not beholden to society. It's not beholden to anything outside. And I, as a person, uh, follow that same principle as well. I want to talk mostly about the tradition as it affects the group, but there's some other stuff as well. And the way that principle works out, there was an old chap in AA in East London who used to say, "Don't be a people pleaser, be a God pleaser. There's only one of him." And this is the point. If God is found within, that's who you're supposed to be pleasing, not everyone else. And sometimes in AA, the way people respond to the service structure, some people, I'm no exception. Some people in AA have a tiny little bit of a problem with authority figures. You know, parents, teachers, bosses, governments, whatever. And here's the funny old thing. You think people in AA who generally have a problem with authority figures would want to avoid creating authority figures. I mean, it would make sense, wouldn't it? You don't like authority figures? You wouldn't, well, you avoid them then. And what do people do? They see the service structure, which is there to support the groups, as an authority over them, and then blame the service structure for everything, which is what the whole authority problem is about. If you can find someone else who is more to blame than you, you're off scot-free, and it gets rid of your own guilt. And I see this happening in the service structure the whole time. It's happening at the moment because of the situation that uh, people are contacting board trustees about, if we open up the meetings again face to face, what happens about track and trace? Do we have to comply with track? None of the boards are not in charge of that. The group's in charge of that. But everyone wants the board to say something so they can criticize the board and say that it's wrong. Um, Now it's all very well to seek guidance, and I think it's one great thing about the service structure. It does provide an opportunity to get input from other groups about what works well and what works badly in other groups. And the service structure is there to provide services that cannot be provided at group level. But how a group interacts with the establishment that it meets in, which may have its requirements, how it interacts with the local authority is up to the group, not up to anyone else. No one can tell us what to do, as long as blah blah blah. We'll come to the caveats in a minute. And the problem, you see, if you're independent, if I'm responsible for my own fate, if my group is responsible for its own fate, it has to take responsibility. And that's a bit alarming. One of the core fears when people do an inventory in AA, one of the core fears that people come up with is the fear of freedom. Because if you're free, you're responsible for the decisions that you make and for the consequences of those decisions, and you have to live with those. And that's very frightening. And so you need something other than the thought that's just come into your head to guide you. And this is where the higher power comes in. So the higher power comes in, I think, in all of the traditions. And it says, with respect to its own affairs, each group should be responsible to no other authority than its own conscience. What is its conscience? It's what it decides in the group conscience meeting, as they call them. And what do you say there? Well, when I'm in a group conscience, I need to be informed and I need to be asking my own higher power. So ultimately, the higher power's in charge. And that's who the group is supposed to be responsible to. And it does beg the question, if the individuals don't have a higher power or don't have a working relationship with the higher power, is it its own conscience that it's listening to, or is it the personalities of the individuals? When I'm behaving badly in a group conscience meeting and I'm not speaking from a position of peace, then it's not my conscience which is prompting me to speak, it's my ego. And I'm not the only one. I'm not going to name names, but I'm not the only one who has spoken from ego in a group conscience meeting. And it tends to be contagious. One person kicks off, and everybody else's ego spots it, and then their egos kick off. There, there is a Nadia Ginsburg is an American comedian and impressionist, and there's a video on YouTube of Nadia Ginsburg playing Madonna, the singer, not the Mother of God. She's playing Madonna, and there's someone a little bit short playing Madonna's daughter, and they have this argument, and at the end, it's the most brilliant sketch. But at the end of it, Madonna says to her daughter, "We're not having an argument. Mummy's ego is having an argument with your ego." And that's what happens in group conscience meetings. That no one's you're sitting there fine, but the avatars of the egos above our heads are arguing with each other, and that's when chaos ensues. So for tradition 4 to operate properly, you've got to have a proper functioning tradition 2. To have a tradition 2, people have got to be in contact with their higher power. So the individuals need to have a functioning step 11. So without a functioning step 11, you've got chaos in tradition 4. What else? One thing that I like about tradition 4 is that, okay, so I'm going to backtrack a bit. It became very fashionable in the 1990s in AA and into the 2000s for big book workshops to start off with something called AA myth busting. And people would list all sorts of things that they say in middle of the road AA or ordinary AA or mainstream AA, and one by one would attack those things. So they'd take the phrase "don't drink and go to meetings," and then they'd try to prove with reference to the big book that this is an inappropriate thing to say. Or they'd say there are no musts in AA, or that we're always recovering, we're never recovered. And one by one they'd bust these. And I think it's a little bit of a breach of tradition 4, really. And I've been absolutely guilty of this. I've been guilty of and I'm doing it now, disparaging other ways of doing things in AA. What I want to talk about, though, is what would the tradition ask me to do? The tradition would say that what I'm supposed to do in my home group is share my own experience, strength, and hope. And just to share that in a positive way, and not to say the other groups who are doing the other groups who, just chat about their week, they're doing it wrong. They're not doing it wrong. They're following their own conscience. Who's to say the higher power isn't behind that? Who's to say the higher power's work is not being done there? So tradition 4, when it comes to my home group, reminds me to mind my own business, and not mind everybody else's. So to keep other people's wind out of my sails, and to keep my wind out of other people's sails. And I don't know about you, but sometimes I go to groups which are not my home group, and within 5 minutes, I'm internally huffing and puffing about how everything is done. Well, I wouldn't have chosen that reading, and you're choosing them to share? Seriously? And what I'll then try to do is to share graciously, but telegraph how I disagree with all the things that are going on here. What I'm trying to learn to do is when I go to other groups, to respect the way they do things and respect their conscience about the way they share the way, and not to try to carve out a personality for myself as being someone that's come in from outside doing it differently, trying to show everyone how it's done. So if other groups want to do things differently, not to go and stir. If I don't like it, don't go. If I like it, fit in with it. Not to tr and it's the same with different fellowships as well. So when I go to Al-Anon meetings, I speak Al-Anon. I don't make any. It's a bit like Klingon, Al-Anon. It's a whole language. I don't make reference to the fact that I'm in AA at all. Like, you wouldn't know when I share in Al-Anon that I've ever been to an AA meeting. And it's respecting the integrity of each group. It's respecting the integrity of each fellowship. But the same works the other way around as well. So sometimes, I think I've mentioned this before, that strong groups in any city are going to develop a reputation, and people will gossip about them. It happens absolutely everywhere. If other people have an opinion about my group, let them. If they don't want to come, they don't have to. If they don't like it, they don't have to come. So we leave other groups alone, they leave us alone, and then we can be at peace and we can be cordial with them. And it talks about the caveat, which is that we have to be careful how we affect other groups or AA as a whole. And I have to say, I think AA must run very well, because I've been racking my brains this week saying, well, when have I seen instances of tradition 4 really seriously being breached, or groups really affecting other groups? And it's very, very hard to find examples of it. Some practical ones which are helpful. I'm not sure how it's done in Sydney, but public information work in the UK, in Great Britain rather, Northern Ireland is not part of the service structure for Great Britain, it's part of the Ireland service structure. So in AA and GB, lots of public information work is delegated to the intergroup and then to the region and then to national level through the subcommittees. But especially over the last 5 years, a lot of groups have started doing their own public information work. And of course, this can create problems because you can overlap with the public information work of other groups, and indeed with the work of intergroup. So if you're going to do anything like that, including putting up posters and going into doctors' surgeries and all the usual stuff, to have a very clear boundary of the geographical area which you're operating in, keep super good records, and keep everyone informed the whole time. And this happens as well. This question arises also at national level. So sometimes, I've been on a national subcommittee for public information for armed services, and you've got to be terribly careful. So whatever you're doing at a national level will fall geographically within one of the regions or one of the intergroups. And to always give the local people first dibs on doing the public information work, the actual field work, even though it has to be organised nationally. And this keeps relations cordial. and to make sure that you do get through to the chair, not just send them an email, hope they've read it, and then launch in. To make sure you really make contact with people, and it's not so much getting their permission, it's offering them, as I say, first dibs, and then going in yourself if they can't or won't take up the opportunity. One genuine area where a group can affect another is when you're starting new groups. And there are parts of the UK, um, uh, I think Bournemouth is one of the cities where this takes place. If you want to start a new meeting, uh, the culture is that you go and check with all of the other meetings around whether it's okay to start the meeting at the time, in the place, with the content. Now, what the tradition actually says, I mean, that's their informal tradition. What tradition 4 says is when its plans concern the welfare of neighbouring groups also, these groups ought to be consulted. And obviously, it can affect the welfare if you're going to drain membership of other groups and reduce their tradition 7 pot, then certainly you could affect them. But here's the interesting thing. It says these groups ought to be consulted. It doesn't mean that you have to have a vote and the other groups have to let you before you can start. You can start the group anyway, and they can, if they don't like it, they can swivel. Bless them. But we don't have to get other groups' permission to start. And so I'm a little bit troubled when that happens in AA, where I've seen it happen that uh, the local area just won't approve a group and the group doesn't start. And what I've noticed with AA over the years, what makes it fluid and healthy is tradition 7. The fact that if people don't appreciate the meeting or the group enough to put money in the pot, it won't survive. And sometimes new groups, which are just more effective and more focused and more helpful to more people, they start up, lots of people start going, and then other groups die. And sometimes people get very attached to a group. There's a group that again, I better not say where it is. There's a group that started somewhere in London. How's that for anonymous? Oh, like 50 years ago. And AA in the area in question changed substantially like 10, 12 years ago, and the change is still ongoing. This very, very old meeting is very old-fashioned in its style and its approach, and it's been dying on its legs for 10 years, with people putting lots of money in the pot to force it to keep going, and they're running around other meetings saying, this meeting's been going for so long, and it would be a shame if the oldest meeting in this part of London were to die. Why? It's the individual's recovery that matters. It's not this notional thing of the group. The group is not valuable per se. It's the spirit that moves through it. And if the spirit stops moving through it, the spirit wants to go somewhere else. Let the spirit go somewhere else. Um, so I've let groups die natural deaths rather than keeping them alive on life support for months or even years afterwards, passing around the begging bowl at other meetings. So that the spiritual market forces of tradition 7, I think, are a very healthy thing. There's nothing to say. A couple of friends and I left what was our home group for many years recently, and there was another one, and we're involved in that. And we had this like 8 seconds of worry. What's going to happen if we leave? It's going to fall apart. I mean, of course, it hasn't fallen apart. But if it does, one of my friends said, well, who's to say that a group is supposed to be there forever? Maybe God's purpose is that it's there for a year, it's there for 5 years, it's there for 10 years, it's served its purpose, it's done, let it go. And I think that's a healthy view. There are other points as well where situations where uh, intergroup has had to step in. Um, and it's where the group is run in such a way that it gives a false impression of AA to a newcomer walking in through the door. Now, examples of this are where there have been groups around Great Britain, not many, but groups where they have very Jesus-y literature. So they've got the AA literature, then they've got the Jesus-y literature about you can't recover unless you make Jesus your personal savior and blah, blah, blah. They may be right. I mean, who knows? But that's not the official AA view. And so the idea is we don't want newcomers to come in and think that that's AA, that you need to find Jesus to get sober. And it's the same with other questionable literature. And by that I don't mean the Al-Anon literature. We have Al-Anon literature at some home groups I've been to, but we have it on a separate table with a sign so people know that we're not Al-Anon. But other than those situations, I haven't seen situations where groups are genuinely affecting the AA as a whole. Although there is the principle of the traditions, it's not just at group level, it then gets expanded to other levels of AA. And the situation where an action within AA could affect AA as a whole is actually there are two. There's publishing ad hoc literature and there's conventions and conferences. So in Great Britain, things are run very tightly. If something is published by AA, which says copyright, Alcoholics Anonymous, Great Britain, whatever the name of the company is, it has to go through conference, and it's a groaning process which lasts years. And the difficulty is that you're hamstringing the ability of the fellowship to respond to situations, to produce posters for ad hoc purposes. And this was going to be a question for conference this year. The conference has been postponed, and the question has been postponed. But the principle still applies that subcommittees and intergroups and regions, and I guess you have areas and districts there, will on occasion want to publish little pamphlets or flyers or posters or similar. And because the material is going to be in the public domain, it's going to affect AA as a whole. So you've got a problem potentially if you say something out of line with basic AA principles. You could be damaging AA's public image. Now, there's a very, very hard line taken by a lot of people, which is basically if you put a word in writing, it has to go through conference. So someone puts up a poster, and then at a region meeting, someone says, "Has that poster been through conference?" And they know that it hasn't. It's one of those little sarcastic questions. What they mean is you shouldn't have put the poster up because it didn't go through conference, but it's posed as a question. Fine. There's a very important principle in Bill W.'s concept essays, and he talks about the two guiding principles for judging the success of an AA endeavor being effectiveness and efficiency. You've got to get it done right, but if it's not efficient, it's not going to be done right anyway, because it takes so long to get anything done, you can't get anything done. So you've got to have some flexibility and fluidity. So with this question, no group, regional committee, or individual should ever take any action that might greatly affect AA as a whole. That's a big word, greatly. Greatly affect AA as a whole without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board. So when you're looking at national subcommittees or regions or intergroups or areas or districts producing videos, producing sound recordings, producing other materials, it's only a breach of tradition if it might greatly affect AA as a whole. And that's a really high hurdle to my mind. Secondly, without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board. So the question is, does every video, does every poster, should it have to go through conference? No. Conference is there for general questions of policy, major issues of policy and finance. It's talking here about the trustees of the General Service Board, and it's not hard to get a question put past a trustee. or indeed a trustee plus the trustees national subcommittee. So if you're a subcommittee, or if you're a region or an intergroup, an area or a district, and you've got a video, you've got a poster, you've got a pamphlet, you've got a flyer, to satisfy tradition four and make sure that you're not going to affect AA as a whole if it's going to be controversial, it should be fine, according to this, to push it past the board trustee, who on behalf of the board can take a view. If it's super controversial, then maybe it can go to the whole board. If it's super controversial, maybe it can go to the whole fellowship in the conference. But this idea that everything in AA has to go to the group conscience, for instance, like you have the tiniest little decision in a meeting, we have to hold a group conscience. The tiniest little poster in AA, the whole fellowship of 5,000 groups needs to have a view on this. No, it doesn't. It needs to have a view on general matters of policy and finance. If stuff is going to affect AA as a whole, there are mechanisms of delegation to make sure you can get proper oversight in place without the whole system being gummed up. And the last situation is conventions and conferences. These are very public, and partly um, so I'll give you an example. Many years ago, and again, I'm going to have to be careful about anonymity. Um, there was an example of an AA venue in another country where AA had been holding events for 50 years, and a convention was held there, which was an AA convention. So it was AA in name, but it was actually outside the service structure. So it had its own committee and everything. And it had a lot of support from local groups. But there was no formal oversight, and they basically trashed the place and caused physical damage in all sorts of ways and disturbed the other guests of the hotel or the venue or whatever it was. And the venue said, we never want to have anything to do with AA ever again. It was a big blow to the local community. In another galaxy far away, there was a convention a few years ago where the treasury ran into problems financially, and it got into the local newspapers. It was a huge scandal. And again, what these two events had in common, this is what I was going to say, is that these AA events are partly in the public domain because they're at the venues, they're often very visible. If something goes wrong, it can definitely get into the local press. And the Great Britain's service and structure manuals suggest that if you're going to hold a convention, it has to be sponsored by an intergroup or a region or some combination thereof, or the board. And what being sponsored means is that it's operationally and financially under the oversight of a committee or a board which represents the interests of the whole fellowship. So you've got like it's like companies have a board of an executive board, and then maybe a supervisory board in some jurisdictions. It's the same idea. And what that board can do, so let's say it's London Region North sponsors a convention. It seeds the money. Any money left over at the end goes back to the region and is ring-fenced in a separate bank account for seeding future events. And it has to be reported into on a regular basis, so that if the region is worried about the way that it's being run, if it's not being run properly financially or operationally, it's got under the concept, it's got four things it can do. Censure, it can tell them off. Redirect, it can tell them to do particular things. Reorganize, it can shift people around in the committee, or it can replace everyone on the committee. And this is an immensely important power. It's obviously an ultimate power that should be exercised only with great caution and only in extreme circumstances. But that's the safety mechanism, safety valve against entities calling themselves AA, but getting involved in major ventures and then dragging AA's name down in the public perception. Individual groups, there's a limit to how much damage an individual group can do. So there have been various scandals around the world of individual groups behaving very badly. But the general perception is that, in my perception, that people know that there's a gazillion other groups, and this is anomalous. They're not representative of AA as a whole. These bigger events, it's a slightly different thing. There was a question here. What of the attitude, if a newcomer attends your group, they'll be exposed to what I think is the wrong way to do AA. This affects AA as a whole. So yeah, I think it's a legitimate question. If you take the assertion that you have to have Jesus to get sober, or that you can't be gay, like if you do the steps, that will get rid of your, sexual deviance, and that was a view of one group in Great Britain a while ago, and the group got shut down in the end. I'm told. I don't know the full details of it. That's something on which the fellowship in general could probably agree is not general AA policy. Now, if you went to 10 different groups, you'd hear 10 different ways of doing AA. But it would be very difficult to get general consensus that, this group's doing the steps too quickly, this group's doing the steps too slowly, there's too much emphasis on therapy and yoga here, there's not enough emphasis on therapy and yoga there. I've been to groups, I'm sure you have too, where the main message throughout person after person shares that the best thing about AA is it helped them to get outside help, and that's what really solved the problem. It's a view. And if that's people's experience, that's people's experience. That's the best thing AA did for them. What are they supposed to do? Not say it? But there's a line here. And I'm afraid the line of judgment, when is it crossed? It's a matter of it's a personal view. I think it should be exercised very cautiously, this notion telling groups off for doing something wrong, and it's only when they've done something really egregious that I believe other groups should have a view, and that's what I see happening in AA in general. It's only in very extreme circumstances. Let me see. There are some other questions. Here are my notes there. So I want to talk about tradition 4 in other areas, and specifically in relationships. So I've been with someone for 16 years. I think my voice a little bit low. It's a small flat. Been married for a while. We get on very well. And one of the principles we apply, and I apply this consciously, I think he just applies it naturally and instinctively, is this notion in AA, in tradition 4, of my group does what it wants, your group does what you want. And if we have a common endeavour, then that common endeavour, whether it's intergroup, region, national conference, convention, anything else, is subject to the principle of concept 12, discussion, vote, and substantial unanimity. Translated into personal relationships, this means that I have my own private domain, he has his own private domain, and then we have a common domain. And in that common domain, there are the areas of the flat we both use. There's an area of the flat which is basically his. There's an area of the flat which is basically mine. And then there's common areas. There's running the household as a whole. There's holidays. There's dividing duties. There's spending time together. And then there's shared obligations with families. So you've got 3 domains. And what I've had to learn is that his private domain is none of my business. His shelves and cupboards, how he organizes those, if he organizes those, none of my business. Common areas become common business, but his private areas are his business. And what else is private? Uh, there's a very good speaker called Rabbi Manis Friedman, Manis Friedman, Friedman, and he writes and talks a lot about relationships. And he talks about the notion of modesty, and I don't mean in terms of, dressing becomingly and wearing long clothes. The sense of, if someone's got lots of character defects, to give them the dignity to have those character defects without you prying and peering in and waving your little bony finger of contention every time they display one of them, to give them the right to just have their quirks and their hang-ups and their weirdnesses, and it's none of my business to avert my eyes, to look the other way. This means I should have no opinion. This is tradition 10 linking into tradition 4. No opinion on the other person's private life. It's 11 o'clock. Who are they texting? It's not my business. It's their business. And we had a conversation about trust a few years ago, not because we had a trust problem, but we know people that have trust problems. And he said, the thing is, either you trust the person or you don't. If you don't trust them, why did you pick them? Pick someone you trust. Don't pick someone you don't trust and then carp at them because you don't trust them. What kind of fool does that? So if I trust him, who he's texting at 11 o'clock at night is his business, not mine. And I've heard a lot of step fives and a lot of inventory over the years. And one common pattern, and this isn't betraying an individual confidence, one pattern is snooping into people's Facebook accounts, and when they leave the room, the eyes go across to the phone. I wonder what's on there. And then people read stuff and learn stuff they shouldn't have learned. I breached someone's privacy when I was 14 or 15. I broke into something, and I've had my own privacy breached. And I think the reason I have trust in this relationship is because we basically respect each other and we respect each other's privacy. Um, anyone who knows me a little bit will know I have a couple of quirks. I think the technical term for those is character defects. There are parts of me which I haven't even begun. I've been sober since 1993, right? But there are areas I haven't begun to reconstruct. I have weird reactions to all sorts of shit. He never interferes with any of that. He just lets me be myself. And I think that's the essence of love, is not sitting there with this ideal image of who you think the other person ought to be and constantly measuring them against the ideal image and finding them wanting. And I think that makes for a lot of peace in my relation. And it's not just with him, it's with other people in my life. My mother is very elderly, and she's partly because her memory is going, but she's happier than she used to be. And when I started to, this is about 10, 11 years ago, when I started to let her be unhappy without seeing her being unhappy as a problem, I relaxed, and then funnily enough, she relaxed. She subconsciously sensed the pressure of having to not be unhappy because of me. As soon as I was okay, even if she wasn't okay, she was okay because she didn't need to be okay. As soon as you need to be okay, you can't be okay because that's too much burden. As soon as you cannot be okay, you're okay because you don't need to be okay. You may need to listen back to that one over again later. There's another quotation. Let's see if can I find it? Give me a second. Yeah, so, oh, where is it? Oh, there we go. So this is a quote, and I'll post it into the chat box if I'm able to. Um, this is a quotation from Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, a rabbi from Eastern Europe from many generations ago. If I am because I am I, and you are because you are you, then I am I and you are you. But if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not I and you are not you. So that's a little riddle for the rest of today. Can I post that? I can. There we go. So it's this idea that I'm allowed to have my own identity, and it doesn't have to please anyone. It doesn't have to be good or bad or right or wrong. Um, and the other person exactly the same. Now, the common area, that's where, um, as I said earlier, it's the principle of discussion, vote, and substantial unanimity. So we're not decided until we're decided, and a decision has been made once we agree. And that requires a lot of yielding. And the three mottos for a successful relationship I was given are these. Number one, yield. Number two, forgive. Number three, serve. Now, when I feel that I'm yielding, he just thinks I'm seeing sense at last. And that's going to work the other way around as well. So don't think you're giving up anything great by yielding. You're probably just seeing sense. Um, have you noticed that your little private rules for how things ought to be around the flat are always super rational and others are crazy and irrelevant? Uh, it with yielding to someone else's view, I don't yield because it makes sense. If your other half appreciates flowers, you don't say, "What's the point though? Why do you want flowers? They're gonna die anyway. It's terrible for the environment. How about a monkey wrench? Wouldn't you rather have a monkey wrench? That's far more useful." If they want flowers, you give them flowers. If what they want is to be left in peace, you leave them in peace. If you speak to them and they don't answer, they want to be left in peace. I needed to be told that. I read for many years you responding to me with silence with just try harder. So yield, forgive, and serve. Um, Jim Willis would say that Uh, our job is to help the rest of God's kids get their heart's desire. What is their heart's desire? Whatever they say they want, give it to them, unless unless it's gonna harm them. The big book. Um, oh, just one thing. I don't have a right to know anything about my other half's personal thoughts, feelings, internal world, past, exes, plans for the future. None of my business. I don't have a right. A friend of mine who's got a very good recovery says that one of the most chilling images he's ever come across, he saw it in a sketch, couple sitting on the sofa watching television. I don't know if it was a he or she, let's say she for the sake of argument, picks up the remote, pauses the television program. She holds his hand, looks into his eyes and says, "No secrets, eh?" Squeezes his hand, turns the television back on. Absolutely chilling. This notion of Big Brother, there is no part of your life that other people don't have a right to peer into. Um, I have room to move and breathe, and my other half has too, and we find this works very well. May not be true for maybe for some other people, they have an agreement that there isn't a quiet corner. Fine. If you can make that work, send me a postcard. There are some great principles. That wasn't meant to be as sarcastic as it sounded, but hey. Um, so uh, there are some great big book quotations on how to handle the common ground. So the first one is from page 108. And this is how to handle the other person having character defects. Treat him when you can as though he had pneumonia. So there's no such thing as sin. Uh, there's just someone not being at their best, a little bit peaky, a little bit below the weather. Next one, page 111. The first principle of success is that you should never be angry. Never. That's the rule. There we go. Even though your husband becomes unbearable and you have to leave him temporarily, you should, if you can, go without rancor. Patience and good temper are most necessary. I know when I'm in trouble because Jonathan says, I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to go and sit in the other room. So this idea of going without rancor, and you have to leave him temporarily, that's not just about leaving relationships for 6 months. That could mean leaving the room. When he leaves the room in those circumstances, I think very hard about what I've done. And when he comes back, I apologize because I've always done something. Page 118. Next time you and he have a heated discussion, no matter what the subject, it should be the privilege of either to smile and say, this is getting serious. I'm sorry I got disturbed. Let's talk about it later. So, and this is all under the heading, what does this have to do with tradition 4? It has to do where what we're doing is affecting the other person. So, common ground. We don't argue, we discuss. If we get tense, we go and do something else and come back to it later. And also 117, I haven't got the book to hand. 117, there's something about, doesn't mean you have to disagree. It doesn't mean you have to agree with your other half, but you don't have to disagree in an unhelpful or resentful spirit, something like that. And so it does mean that we can pick each other up on stuff. The other day I was getting squawky about something, and he just quietly said, dial it back. What I've learnt to do to keep the peace is when something like that comes over the parapet, then to just yield, obey, just do what you're asked to do. Don Pritz said a couple of good things about relationships. I'm sure I've mentioned these before. First one, if you want a good relationship with God, you say, thy will be done. If you want a good relationship with your partner, you say, I will be done. He also said, I don't know how to have a healthy sick relationship. If I'm not in the relationship for the purposes of yielding and forgiveness and service, if I'm not in the relationship in good faith, then there is no way to make it work. If I'm in a relationship with someone who is not in the relationship for good faith, there is no way of making it work. And I may come to more examples of that later on. Page 118. Patience, tolerance, understanding, and love are the watchwords. Show him these things in yourself, and they will be reflected back to you from him. Live and let live is the rule. If you both show a willingness to remedy your own defects, there will be little need to criticize each other. And tradition 4 in practice, therefore, means that I need to keep a close eye on whether and how I'm affecting my other half negatively. I don't get this right all the time by any means. This is the ideal towards which I'm willing to grow. Page 69, ideal. And since he does the same thing, we generally don't need to be constantly setting boundaries. Occasionally we'll have to make a polite request or point something out. But generally, because he's attentive to me and I'm attentive to him, we just figure it out. It doesn't all need to be this obstacle course of constant boundary setting because we're paying attention. It's like two people dancing around each other. If you're paying attention, you won't tread on each other's toes. And so that's how to actually apply it in practice, to just be observant. Watch what effect your words have, your body language, your tone of voice, all of those things. Um, this notion in tradition 4 of conferring and consultation. And so this happens for two reasons. Either I'm planning something which could affect him. So because my AA schedule often affects our common life, and I run everything past him. If I'm going to a particular country, I'll say, "Are you happy for me to go there on my own?" Sometimes the country is tricky, shall we say. I get his blessing before I go. Uh, the second area is common decisions about the flat, about our common activities, about how we run our common affairs. And I've already said what we decide together is that these major decisions of policy and finance. But then this is where the concepts really come into their own. Once we have together made our common decision of policy or finance, the actual implementation gets handed to him or to me. So that there are a number of decisions which are currently in his court, which he's going to. I'm scot-free. There are a number of responsibilities which are mine, and we get, just like with the board reporting back to conference, we get to report back to each other on how well we've discharged our responsibilities. So there's a very clear delineation of duties. So it's just like inside a group where uh, the group makes major decisions of policy and finance and then delegates the implementation to particular officers who are allowed to get on with their jobs without being meddled with, but then they have to report back and then they can be redirected and so on. There's a question here as well about, each person is free, autonomous, except in as far as it affects the other person. How this applies in the relationship, I've got to really ask myself with boundary setting, is something someone else is doing actually affecting me, or is it just pissing me off? There's a difference. So something which actually affects me, I'll give you an example, is if I don't get 87 hours of sleep every night, I'm useless the next day. If I go to bed 20 minutes later, I literally have jet lag for 2 days. I don't deal well with it. And that does affect me because it affects my ability to get a proper day's activities done the next day. So that's something where it's legitimate for me to make a polite request. I'm just going to cover briefly um, this notion of boundaries. So I talk to a lot of people in Al-Anon and S-Anon and similar the other Anon fellowships. And about 6 weeks into being in Al-Anon, uh, people tend to hear this notion of boundaries and setting boundaries, and they get super excited about, and suddenly they now have a legitimate way to order everyone around them to behave in a particular way, to think in a particular way, to believe in a particular way, because if they don't, they're going to be triggered. And it takes the next 10 years in Al-Anon to get people to dial that one back to something which is reasonable. Um, there's a song, I can't remember the name of the musical or TV show. I think it was a TV show which had a musical episode where the title of the song was "Your Boundary Is My Trigger," and so that can go round and round in circles with boundaries and triggers and microaggressions and blah blah blah. Um, so I try to, when does something affect me, and then I is legitimate to say something. I try to keep it to an absolute minimum. My experience with setting boundaries is you've only got so many vouchers to use before all the goodwill is gone. I don't know why that's the case, but the data suggests that that is the case. If I go beyond a certain threshold, I'm not setting boundaries, I'm being a bulldozer. That threshold is really low with most people. Most people are not very amenable to boundaries or requests. The way I try and do them, if I'm going to have to say something, it isn't very often at all. And this is not just with my other half, this is in life generally, with clients, with whatever. The 5 ways to set a boundary, if I'm asking someone else to do something, is just ask. I was talking to someone the other day that she was talking about her sponsor, and this is something I've heard so many times. She had a problem with the sponsor, small situation. She was like, "I need a new sponsor." Well, have you made the request to your sponsor to do X, Y, and Z? Well, no, I haven't, but I know what she's going to say. Do you really? How about you try that first? Like, you know, if there's a problem with the window on the car, you don't sell the car, you see if you can fix the window first. So just make the request. The second way is to offer a transaction. If I go to your mother's next weekend, will you come with me to my mother's the weekend after? The third way to get something done make overt uh, is to set overt conditions. I mean, threat is too strong a word, but it's kind of a threat. So with new sponsees, if you don't call me every day, or at least contact me to say why you can't call if there is a situation, the deal is off. I'm not going to play cat and mouse with this. So that's a way to get set. It's a way to set a boundary. You're clear. Sometimes people have set boundaries with me tacitly. If I text someone aggressively, they won't respond. If I text them pleasantly, they respond. And so I learn if I want them to respond, I have to be nice. And then in extremis, there are situations where you have to just use force. You have to change the locks. You have to call the police. You have to go and do it yourself, whatever it is. Um, but with these requests, what I've been taught to do is to make the request going forward. So rather than saying, you did these 73 things which really upset me, you say, hey, in future, would it be okay if dot dot dot? So that you're not criticizing them for something they've done, you're simply politely requesting that they do something else in the future. Um, I'm going to wrap up fairly soon, but there are a few other points here. Um, there is this notion of following one's own conscience in tradition for. So the group has to follow its own conscience rather than just fitting in with other people. And sometimes that can cause conflict. The point about being a people pleaser is that you're trying to avoid conflict, but you're not getting good results out of it. No one is actually pleased. My friend James always says about people pleasers. He says, I don't know why they call themselves people pleasers. They never please me. So it never works. It never works anyway. But I've noticed this with sponsorship. I've noticed my own tendency to remain in dysfunctional situations because I'm frightened of following my own conscience. And there are all sorts of games that can get played out, not intentionally. People are very, very rarely intentioned. I've had a couple of instances in 27 years where people are genuinely ill-intentioned. In my experience, it's exceptionally rare. It's people acting out stuff without knowing they're acting it out. And I've done it myself with sponsors. I'll give you some examples of acting out. Um, I would be after a relapse. This was when I was relapsing in the early 90s. I would be like the best sponsee in the world for 3 days to a week, in order to convince myself I was really giving AA a go, so that when I drank, I didn't have to feel so guilty about it. And so I wasn't being sponsored. I was engaging in a game which was there to relieve my guilt. I've used sponsorship as a band-aid on my emotions. So I don't want recovery, I want relief. I want you to make me feel better. I don't want to change, but I want you to make me feel better. Activity in the place of action. Sometimes I want to inveigle a sponsor into taking me through the steps another time so that I can have a new experience. There are little air quotes if you're listening to this on the tape there. It's because I don't want to stop overeating today. I don't want to go through the pain of not having the second plate of food I don't actually need. I would rather sit and discuss this for another 6 months, go to another fellowship for 5 years, and then stop eating the second plate. And so often I will try and engage sponsors in activity as a way of avoiding action. What else have I done? I want the sponsor to make decisions for me, so if it goes wrong, it's not my fault, it's their fault. Um, what else? This is the other thing. Have you ever consulted a sponsor, argued with them, proved them wrong in your own terms, and then been vindicated that you're now doing the right thing because you run it past your sponsor, but your sponsor clearly had no wisdom to offer, so you're going to go and do it anyway? I've done this. I've got into the most horrible emotional and practical entanglements. And I've tricked myself into thinking that I've got this signed off by someone because I went through the consultation process. It wasn't a real consultation process. It was pigeon chess. My sponsor was playing chess. I was the pigeon strutting all over the board, knocking the pieces over and then acting like it won. And this is an abuse of the sponsorship process that I've engaged in as a sponsee many times. I phone up for what looks like advice, but unless you agree with me, I'm not going to take it. I'm not looking for advice. I'm looking for something else. Um, and also, using calling my sponsor so that I can say at a meeting, oh, well, I was talking to my sponsor today, and he said, I don't want to talk to him. I just want to be able to tell other people I've been talking to my sponsor. So I'm still sponsorable after all these years. How wonderful am I that I'm so spiritual that I'm still teachable? These are all abuses of the sponsorship process, and my sponsor can sniff those out through lead. And I've learned to as well. So sometimes I have to follow my conscience and push back as a sponsor and push back again and again and again to say, this is not right. You're trying to get me to do your job for you. You're trying to get me to think through something you should be thinking through yourself. So this notion in tradition 4 of following your own conscience rather than being a people pleaser is very, very tough. One last couple of last things, and then I'm actually going to shut up. Following my own conscience is a bit in the big book where when you're 12th stepping someone, if the person says that they don't want to follow your suggested course of action, that you encourage them to follow their own conscience. And it's very interesting that it's conscience, i.e., that deep, still, quiet voice. I spent most of my life not listening to my conscience, but listening to surface impulses. Eat this, go there, say this. Oh, I've just thought of something to say. I'm going to say it. Blah! Out it comes. And so to be a conscience pleaser, to be listening to my conscience, I've got to learn to not suppress, but not respond to impulses. And this is immensely painful. The practice of tradition 4, of having as one's only authority one's inner conscience with this quiet eye on how one is affecting the rest of the world, but it's a quiet eye, if eyes can be quiet. Is painful because I've got to constantly disengage from the monkey mind, that surface chatter, and sink all the way down to where consciousness actually resides. So, and the last point, so this responsible exercise of spiritual autonomy. The 4 things I can do to work out if I'm affecting someone else. Number 1, just think it through. Just stop for 5 seconds and think. Secondly, to put myself in their shoes. It's an idea which recurs throughout the big book. Thirdly, to watch out and listen out for the impact that I'm having. It will betray itself physically if the person is in front of you. Their body language will tell you how they're responding. Like, if they leave the room, they don't want to listen to what you have to say. Body language like that, you don't need a body language guru to interpret that one. And just ask them, have I done anything wrong? Is there something you would like me to do differently? It's the most magic question. It comes from step 9, but I try and apply it in my life. Is there something you would like me to do differently? It brings all of the venom to the surface, and then the venom is usually not venom anymore. Anyway, that's all I've got to share today, mercifully. So I'm going to stop and thank you for listening.